Imagine being told that the deadliest war in American history began in April 1861 when Confederate guns opened fire on Fort Sumter. Now imagine discovering that by the time those first shells crossed Charleston Harbor, the real conflict had already been raging for more than 30 years. The armies had not yet formed, the famous generals had not yet taken command, and Abraham Lincoln was still decades away from the White House. But the machinery of civil war was already being assembled inside Congress, state legislatures, banks, plantations, and the rapidly changing American economy. Fort Sumter did not create the Civil War. It was the moment an old American argument finally became impossible to contain. Most Americans are taught a clean explanation for what caused the war. Slavery divided the country, the South seceded, and the North fought to preserve the Union. Slavery absolutely stood at the center of the crisis. The Confederate States themselves would later make that unmistakably clear. But if we stop there, we miss the more disturbing question: how did a system that had existed since before the United States was founded become powerful enough to tear the nation apart later? Why did generations of compromises suddenly stop working? And why were Americans willing to destroy their own union rather than accept the political future that seemed to be approaching? To answer that, we have to go back to a United States that looked almost nothing like the industrial giant it would eventually become. Two increasingly different economic worlds were developing under the same flag. In the North, manufacturing expanded, cities grew, canals and transportation networks connected markets, and merchants pushed for policies that could protect American industry. In the South, wealth rested on plantation agriculture, export crops, and enslaved labor. These differences created a dangerous question: what should the federal government do when one region's preferred economic policy appeared to benefit it at another region's expense? In 1828, that question exploded. Congress passed a protective tariff imposing steep duties on many imported goods. Northern manufacturers welcomed protection from foreign competition. Across much of the South, however, the measure became infamous as the Tariff of Abominations. Southern consumers faced higher prices, while planters feared disruption to the foreign trade their economy depended on. To them, Washington was not merely collecting revenue. Federal power seemed to be shaping the national economy in ways that favored northern industrial development while forcing an agricultural, export-oriented South to absorb the consequences. And South Carolina's response revealed something much larger than anger over taxes. John C. Calhoun, then Vice President of the United States, developed an argument that would echo through the next generation. In the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, Calhoun advanced the doctrine of nullification. A state, he argued, could reject a federal law it considered unconstitutional. If Washington could impose policies a state considered intolerable, what ultimately prevented that state from resisting the federal government itself? Think about how early this was. Lincoln was a teenager. The Republican Party did not exist. Yet Americans were developing the constitutional language that would later be used to justify breaking the Union apart. The confrontation intensified after another tariff was enacted in 1832. South Carolina adopted an ordinance of nullification, declaring the tariffs of 1828 and 1832 null and void within the state. More ominously, its leaders made clear that federal attempts at coercion could lead South Carolina towards secession. President Andrew Jackson was a slaveholder, but he was also fiercely committed to preserving the Union. He rejected South Carolina's claim that a state could simply nullify federal law. Congress passed the Force Bill, authorizing the president to use military means if necessary to enforce federal tariff collection. Suddenly, almost 3 decades before Fort Sumter, Americans faced the possibility that federal troops might confront a southern state over whether Washington's authority could be resisted. The crisis ended without war. Henry Clay helped engineer a compromise tariff in 1833 that gradually reduced duties, allowing South Carolina to retreat without abandoning its principles. But something profound had changed. Secession was no longer an unimaginable abstraction. A state had challenged federal supremacy, threatened separation, and forced national leaders to confront the possibility of military coercion. The arguments had been rehearsed. The constitutional vocabulary had been developed. Americans had discovered that a sufficiently severe regional conflict could turn an argument over policy into an argument over whether the Union itself was voluntary. This is where the story becomes more complicated, because it would be misleading to separate the tariff crisis from slavery. The Southern economy that demanded cheap imported goods was shaped by plantation agriculture, and plantation agriculture rested increasingly on enslaved labor. Economic sovereignty, states' rights, federal authority, and slavery were not isolated boxes. They overlapped. The deeper the plantation system expanded, the more Southern wealth and political power became tied to preserving the conditions that allowed that system to survive. That distinction matters because later generations would frame the coming conflict as a choice between competing explanations: slavery or states' rights, morality or economics, human bondage or constitutional disagreement. But antebellum America did not experience these forces separately. The political arguments grew out of an economic order, and that economic order was inseparable from slavery, the Nullification crisis. Therefore, matters not because tariffs secretly caused the Civil War. They did not. It matters because the crisis exposed the mechanism through which a sectional dispute could become a constitutional rupture. It demonstrated that Southern political leaders could invoke state sovereignty when they believed federal policy threatened regional interests. It showed that Washington might answer resistance with force, and it revealed how compromise could postpone a confrontation without eliminating the forces producing it. What made this dangerous was that each confrontation left behind arguments, precedents, and resentments that the next generation inherited. Compromise could settle the dispute, but it could not answer the deeper question of what happened when regional survival and federal authority collided. For a while, that strategy worked. America expanded westward, commerce grew, cotton production exploded, and politicians repeatedly found ways to hold together a country whose internal contradictions were becoming harder to manage. Territory expanded, population surged, railroads and factories began transforming the economic landscape, but underneath that growth was a problem far larger than the tariff dispute. The institution of slavery was becoming not merely a Southern labor system, but one of the most powerful concentrations of wealth and political influence in the country. Enslaved human beings could be bought, sold, inherited, mortgaged, and used to secure credit. Cotton produced through their forced labor moved through merchants, banks, insurers, ports, and overseas markets. The system connected plantation owners to financial interests far beyond the plantation states. And as America pushed west, an unavoidable question followed every new piece of territory. Would slavery go with it? That question would transform the struggle, because once slavery's expansion became tied to the balance of power in Congress, the future of Western land, and the survival of enormous fortunes, compromise would no longer be simply about drawing lines on maps. It would become a fight over who would control America's future, and that is where the road to civil war truly begins to narrow. By the middle of the 19th century, the argument over slavery was no longer only an argument about morality, labor, or regional culture. It was an argument about wealth on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. In 1860, nearly 4 million people were enslaved in the United States, and under American law, those human beings were treated as property. Enslaved people themselves could be sold, inherited, mortgaged, seized for debt, and pledged as collateral. The institution at the center of America's moral crisis had also become embedded inside its financial system. That reality changes the way the coming political struggle looks. A plantation owner purchasing land often needed credit. Expanding cotton production required more land, equipment, and enslaved laborers, which meant borrowing money. Banks and creditors could accept enslaved people as security for those loans. Human lives were converted into entries on balance sheets. This is what made any threat to slavery feel economically catastrophic to the people whose fortunes depended upon it. Abolition did not merely challenge a labor arrangement. To slaveholders, it threatened to erase an enormous category of property while dismantling the system that generated their income and supported their political status. But the wealth created by slavery did not remain behind plantation gates. Cotton moved outward. Southern factors sold it. Ships carried it from ports such as New Orleans, Mobile, Savannah, and Charleston. Merchants arranged transactions. Banks supplied credit. Insurance companies protected shipments. Northern commercial houses participated in the trade, and British textile manufacturers transformed raw Southern cotton into finished cloth. By the eve of the Civil War, cotton dominated American exports and connected the plantation South to an international network stretching through New York, Liverpool, Manchester, and beyond. That is one of the most uncomfortable truths about antebellum America. Slavery was concentrated geographically in the South, but the economic relationships surrounding slave-grown commodities crossed regional and national borders. Across the Atlantic, British industry had abolished slavery within most of the empire, yet remained heavily dependent on cotton produced by enslaved Americans. So when Southern leaders defended slavery, they were defending more than plantations. They were defending a system of property, credit, export income, social hierarchy, and political power. And that system had one relentless requirement: room to survive. This is where the West becomes crucial. As the United States acquired enormous territories, every expansion created a question Washington could postpone but never permanently answer. Would slavery be permitted there? In reality, it was a battle over the future balance of power in the entire nation. The Senate made that balance especially important. Because every state received 2 senators regardless of population, Southern politicians could protect their interests if slave states remained roughly balanced against free states. A growing free state majority, however, could eventually leave the slaveholding South permanently outnumbered in national politics. The Missouri crisis demonstrated the danger early. In 1820, Congress produced the Missouri Compromise. Missouri entered as a slave state while Maine entered as a free state, a slave state while Maine entered as a free state, preserving sectional balance in the Senate. Congress also drew a geographic line across the Louisiana Purchase at latitude 36 degrees 30 minutes. With the exception of Missouri, slavery would be prohibited in the territory north of that line. It was an extraordinary solution because everyone could see what the line represented. Congress was literally drawing the future of slavery onto the American map. For decades, the arrangement helped suppress the crisis. But westward expansion kept changing the map. California, New Mexico, Utah, and other western lands forced politicians to confront the same explosive issue again. Would these territories enter the Union free or slave? Every answer created winners and losers. If new free states multiplied, Southern power in the Senate would weaken. If slavery expanded westward, Northerners feared that slaveholding interests would gain new political allies and dominate federal policy. The argument was therefore not simply about whether an individual settler could own enslaved people. It was about what kind of society would populate the West and which section would command Washington in the generations ahead. Congress attempted another grand bargain in 1850. California entered the Union as a free state. New Mexico and Utah would approach the slavery question through popular sovereignty, allowing local settlers to influence the decision. But the most incendiary component was the strengthened Fugitive Slave Act. The law gave slaveholders greater federal assistance in recovering people who escaped into free states and imposed penalties on those who obstructed the process. Suddenly, Northerners who might have considered slavery a distant Southern institution could encounter its enforcement in their own communities. Escaped people could be arrested, hearings became public controversies, and resistance intensified. Instead of removing slavery from national politics, the compromise brought the institution closer to northern doorsteps. Then came the decision that shattered what remained of the old territorial settlement. Senator Stephen Douglas wanted Congress to organize the Kansas and Nebraska territories, a step connected to Western development and his hopes for a transcontinental railroad route. Southern support was necessary. The resulting Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 proposed that settlers determine the slavery question through popular sovereignty. There was one enormous problem. Kansas and Nebraska lay largely north of the Missouri Compromise line, where slavery had supposedly been excluded. Allowing popular sovereignty there effectively repealed the restriction that had helped stabilize sectional politics for more than 30 years. The reaction in the North was furious. To many opponents of slavery's expansion, a bargain they believed had permanently closed those territories was being destroyed for political advantage. Old party loyalties fractured. The Whig Party collapsed. Anti-slavery Whigs, Free Soilers, former Democrats, and other opponents of slavery's western expansion began gathering around a new political organization, the Republican Party. Its central early demand was not immediate abolition throughout the South. It was preventing slavery from spreading farther west. That distinction is essential. To many white Northerners, opposition to expansion could coexist with racial prejudice and limited concern for enslaved people already living in southern states. Yet containment still threatened the long-term political strategy of slaveholders. If the West became overwhelmingly free, the South could lose parity in the Senate, lose influence over federal policy, and eventually find slavery surrounded by a political majority hostile to its future. The question had become existential on both sides, and in Kansas, Americans stopped waiting for Congress to settle it. Pro-slavery settlers and activists crossed into the territory determined to secure it for slavery. Anti-slavery settlers arrived with equal determination to make Kansas free. Elections were disputed, rival governments claimed legitimacy, armed groups formed. Threats became raids, raids became killings, and communities began choosing sides. In May 1856, pro-slavery forces attacked Lawrence, an anti-slavery stronghold, destroying newspaper presses and damaging buildings. Days later, John Brown and several followers retaliated near Pottawatomie Creek, killing 5 pro-slavery men. Violence spread across the territory as competing factions fought over an issue politicians had supposedly entrusted to democratic choice. The phrase "Bleeding Kansas" entered the national vocabulary. But Kansas was more than a local tragedy. It was a warning. For decades, American politicians had treated compromise as a pressure valve. When slavery threatened the Union, they balanced states, drew geographic lines, traded concessions, and promised that the next settlement would finally restore peace. Kansas revealed what happened when those mechanisms stopped working. The argument over slavery's future had moved from congressional speeches to armed confrontation. And the most dangerous part was still ahead. If Congress could no longer settle whether slavery could expand westward, the Supreme Court was about to try. Its answer would not calm the nation. It would push America closer to the edge. That meant every new territory carried consequences far beyond its borders. Land policy could reshape congressional power. Congressional power could determine slavery's future. And slavery's future could determine whether the existing Union remained politically sustainable nationally. By the late 1850s, the United States was no longer simply debating whether slavery would expand. Americans were beginning to discover what happened when political institutions could no longer contain a conflict that both sides increasingly viewed as existential. Kansas had provided the warning. Ballot boxes had been manipulated, towns attacked, homes burned, and men killed because settlers understood that whoever controlled one territory might help determine the political future of the nation, but the violence in Kansas was only the beginning. The next blow would come not from an armed militia or a radical abolitionist, but from the highest court in the United States. In 1857, the Supreme Court issued its decision in Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott was an enslaved man who had lived with his owner in areas where slavery was prohibited and later sued for his freedom. His case eventually reached the Supreme Court, where Chief Justice Roger B. Taney delivered a sweeping ruling. The court concluded that Scott could not claim United States citizenship for purposes of bringing his federal suit. But it went much further. The court declared that Congress lacked constitutional authority to prohibit slavery in federal territories in the manner attempted by the Missouri Compromise. Think about what that meant politically. For years, opponents of slavery's expansion had built their strategy around one central promise. Even if the federal government could not immediately abolish slavery inside existing southern states, Congress could stop it from spreading into the West. The Dred Scott decision attacked the constitutional foundation beneath that strategy. If slaveholders possessed constitutional protection for their property in federal territories, then simply electing politicians who promised containment might not be enough. To Southern slaveholders, the ruling appeared to protect rights they believed the Constitution guaranteed. To many Northerners, it looked like evidence that what they called the slave power was gaining control not merely of Southern legislatures, but of national institutions themselves. Distrust deepened. Each side increasingly believed the other was attempting to use the federal government to impose its vision on the entire country. Then, in October 1859, one man turned that fear into terror. John Brown had already become notorious through the violence in Kansas. Now he attempted something far more ambitious. With a small band of followers, Brown seized the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry, Virginia. His objective was to capture weapons, distribute them to enslaved people, and ignite a broader uprising against slavery. The plan collapsed quickly. Local forces surrounded Brown, and United States Marines under Robert E. Lee eventually stormed the engine house where Brown and his surviving followers had barricaded themselves. Brown was captured, tried for crimes including treason against Virginia, and sentenced to death. Militarily, the raid was a failure. Politically, it was explosive. For white Southerners already fearful of slave rebellion, Harper's Ferry seemed to confirm their darkest suspicion. Militant anti-slavery forces might eventually encourage armed insurrection. Brown's raid was frightening enough. Reactions to his execution made the sectional divide even more disturbing. Some Northerners condemned his violence, but others praised his courage or treated him as a martyr willing to die for emancipation. Imagine viewing those reactions from a Southern plantation community. The institution upon which your wealth and social order depended was being denounced by an increasingly powerful political movement. A radical had attempted to arm enslaved people in Virginia, and some people in the North were celebrating his sacrifice. Whether that represented mainstream Northern opinion mattered less than what Southern audiences believed it represented. Politics was increasingly driven by fear of what the other section might eventually do. Then came the presidential election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln is remembered today primarily as the president who issued the Emancipation Proclamation and led the nation through the destruction of slavery. But the Lincoln who campaigned for president in 1860 occupied a more carefully defined political position. He condemned slavery morally and opposed its expansion, while maintaining that the federal government lacked constitutional power to abolish it directly inside states where it already existed. His Republican Party centered its slavery policy on containment. To modern ears, containment can sound moderate. To the slaveholding South, it could look like the beginning of the end. The reason was political arithmetic. If Western territories entered the Union as free states, the free state majority would continue growing. Southern influence in Congress would weaken. The presidency could increasingly be won by Northern electoral votes. The federal government might eventually be controlled by a political coalition fundamentally opposed to slavery's expansion. And once expansion stopped, what came next? That unanswered question terrified slaveholders. They did not have to believe Lincoln planned immediate abolition to see his election as dangerous. They only had to believe that the political system was moving permanently against them. Lincoln's victory demonstrated how far that transformation had already progressed. He won the presidency with less than 40% of the national popular vote in a fractured four-way contest, and his electoral strength came overwhelmingly from the free states. In much of the Deep South, his name did not even appear on the ballot. The message received by Southern political leaders was devastating. The presidency could now be captured without their support. For decades, compromise had depended upon the idea that neither section could dominate the federal government without negotiating with the other. Lincoln's election suggested that demographic growth and sectional political organization were breaking that arrangement. South Carolina acted first. On December 20th, 1860, a convention in Charleston unanimously adopted an ordinance declaring that the union between South Carolina and the other states was dissolved. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed before Lincoln was inaugurated. In February 1861, representatives from the seceding states created the Confederate States of America. And this is the point where one of the most persistent arguments about the Civil War encounters the strongest historical evidence. If secession was primarily about an abstract principle of states' rights, disconnected from slavery, the documents written by the secessionists themselves should tell us that. Instead, slavery appears repeatedly. Mississippi's declaration announced that its position was thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, which it described as the world's greatest material interest. South Carolina emphasized northern resistance to constitutional obligations involving fugitive slaves and warned about the rise of a political movement hostile to slavery. Georgia presented an extensive defense of slavery and described conflicts over its status in the territories. Texas defended a social order explicitly based upon racial slavery. These were not private admissions discovered generations later. They were public explanations written by the people carrying out secession. Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens made the ideological connection even clearer in his March 1861 Cornerstone speech, openly describing racial inequality and black enslavement as foundational principles of the new Confederate government. So was slavery the cause of the Civil War? Yes. But stopping there still leaves an enormous part of the story unexplained, because slavery was not floating separately from everything else Americans had been fighting over. It was property protected by law. It was labor producing internationally valuable commodities. It was wealth supporting a powerful planter class. It shaped representation and congressional power. Its expansion determined the political character of Western territories. Arguments over protecting it produced constitutional theories about federal authority and state sovereignty. That is why the familiar choice between saying the war was about slavery or saying it was about politics, economics, territory, or states' rights creates a false separation. Slavery ran through those disputes. The argument over the West was an argument over whether slavery could expand. The argument over political balance was an argument over whether slaveholding states could preserve national influence. The most important states' rights claims surrounding secession were used to protect a social and economic order built around slavery. By the spring of 1861, those forces had converged. Decades of compromises had failed. The Supreme Court had failed to settle the territorial question. Violence had already erupted in Kansas. John Brown had intensified Southern fears. Lincoln's election demonstrated the growth of a sectional political majority, and secession transformed political resistance into a direct challenge to the existence of the Union. But one final assumption remained. Southern leaders believed the economic importance of their system gave them an extraordinary advantage. Cotton did not merely enrich plantations, it fed the textile mills of the world's most powerful industrial empire. If war came, they believed Europe might have no choice but to intervene. And soon, they would put that belief to the test. When Confederate leaders looked across the Atlantic in 1861, they saw what they believed was their greatest weapon. It was not an army, a general, or a fortress. It was cotton. Britain possessed the world's most powerful industrial economy, and its enormous textile industry depended heavily on cotton grown in the American South. Southern leaders believed that dependence gave them leverage. If Confederate cotton disappeared from European markets, mills would close, workers would lose their jobs, and economic pressure would eventually force Britain or France to recognize the Confederacy and perhaps intervene against the Union blockade. They called the idea King Cotton diplomacy. At first, the logic appeared convincing. The disruption of American cotton contributed to severe shortages in Britain's textile districts. Mills reduced production, or closed, and workers across Lancashire suffered. But the Confederate calculation contained a fatal mistake. Economic dependence did not automatically translate into political intervention. British manufacturers searched for alternative supplies from India, Egypt, Brazil, and elsewhere. Existing inventories softened the initial shock. Britain also depended on trade with the Union, including American grain. A war with Washington could threaten Canada, Atlantic commerce, and British strategic interests across the Western Hemisphere. Then the political meaning of the conflict changed. When Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September 1862, followed by the final proclamation taking effect on January 1, 1863, the Union war effort became explicitly connected to emancipation in Confederate-held territory. The proclamation did not immediately free every enslaved person in America. It exempted loyal slave states in certain Union-controlled areas. But its significance was enormous. The destruction of slavery was now formally attached to Union victory. That made European intervention on behalf of the Confederacy far more difficult. Britain had abolished slavery throughout most of its empire decades earlier, and anti-slavery sentiment remained powerful among the British public. Supporting a Confederacy openly founded on the preservation of slavery carried a political and moral cost that cotton alone could not overcome. Yet, Lincoln's timing also reveals how complicated the war had been from its beginning. 4 slave states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, remained in the Union. Their loyalty mattered enormously. Maryland surrounded Washington on 3 sides. Kentucky occupied a strategic position along major rivers and transportation routes. Lincoln feared that turning the conflict immediately into a war of abolition could drive crucial border states toward secession. That is why the Union initially framed its objective primarily as preserving the nation. The paradox is striking. Slavery caused the secession crisis, but the government fighting secession initially had to manage a coalition containing slaveholders. As the war continued, that contradiction became impossible to sustain. Enslaved people themselves helped force the issue by escaping to Union lines, depriving Confederate owners of labor, and compelling federal commanders to decide their status. Black Americans increasingly transformed emancipation from an abstract political question into a military reality. Eventually, roughly 180,000 black soldiers served in the Union Army, strengthening the war effort while fighting for a freedom whose future remained uncertain. The conflict was becoming something larger than restoring the old Union, and economically, the 2 sides were profoundly unequal. The Confederacy possessed capable commanders, enormous territory, and the strategic advantage of fighting largely on the defensive. But the Union possessed a much larger population, far greater manufacturing capacity, extensive railroad infrastructure, stronger financial institutions, and the ability to sustain industrial warfare on a scale the South struggled to match. Time, therefore, became one of the Union's greatest weapons. The longer the war continued, the harder it became for the Confederacy to replace destroyed railroads, equipment, weapons, food supplies, and soldiers. Union armies penetrated deeper into Southern territory. The blockade tightened. Inflation devastated Confederate purchasing power. Enslaved workers fled plantations wherever Union forces approached, weakening the labor system upon which Southern production depended. By 1865, Confederate armies were collapsing, but Union victory did more than defeat secession. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout the United States. A system that had shaped American wealth, politics, agriculture, territorial expansion, and sectional power for generations was constitutionally destroyed. At the same time, the war transformed the federal government itself. With Southern representatives absent from Congress during much of the conflict, legislation that had faced sectional resistance became possible. The Homestead Act encouraged Western settlement. The Pacific Railway legislation accelerated construction of a transcontinental railroad. The Morrill Act supported land-grant colleges. National banking acts helped create a more unified financial system and national currency. The America emerging from the Civil War was therefore not simply the America of 1860 with slavery removed. It was becoming a different country. Federal authority had expanded dramatically. Industrial capitalism accelerated. Railroads connected enormous markets. Western settlement intensified. The political power of the old planter elite had been shattered, even though racial hierarchy would soon be reconstructed through violence, discriminatory laws, economic coercion, and segregation. And this brings us back to the question we began with: what do historians get wrong about the origins of the American Civil War? The answer is not that slavery was somehow unimportant or merely one cause among many. The evidence left by secessionists themselves makes that impossible to sustain. Slavery stood at the center of the crisis. The deeper mistake is separating slavery from the entire system built around it. Slavery was labor, but it was also wealth. It was property law and credit. It was cotton exports and international commerce. It influenced territorial expansion, congressional representation, presidential politics, federal authority, and the balance between free and slave states. That is why decades of compromise ultimately failed. Americans were not negotiating over one isolated policy. They were trying to preserve a single nation containing political and economic systems moving toward incompatible futures. Fort Sumter was therefore not where the Civil War truly began. The road had been built across decades through nullification, territorial expansion, political compromise, financial interests, constitutional conflict, violence in Kansas, Dred Scott, Harpers Ferry, Lincoln's election, and finally secession. The cannons merely announced that America had reached the end of it, and when the smoke finally cleared, the Union survived. But the country that emerged was no longer the country that had entered the war.